Hello and welcome to the Feynman Factor. My name is Mastane and my guest today is Felipe Salles, and I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Welcome to the show. He's joining me from Boston.
Thank you. My name even in Portuguese can be pronounced different ways, so I'm used to all the variations,
And
actually.
how do you say your name?
Well, see, my parents say Felipe, but my friends say Felipe. So, and then when I moved to the US, it became Felipe, which I got really used to. So now when somebody says any other way other than the Spanish pronunciation, I get a little surprised. But in any case, I normally introduce myself as Felipe Salles.
Okay, so I wasn't too far off, but
No.
Felipe is a composer and a tenor player and multi-reeds player, I think. You were talking about the flute before. Um, Wind player, sorry. And he is going to talk to us about his latest project, which is to do with arranging lullabies. Now, are these traditional Brazilian lullabies?
Yeah, those the lullabies that where all this music is inspired by.
Mm-hmm.
It's their original, century-old lullabies that have been carried through many generations, and some of them, you can trace their origins to Portugal or to Africa, and there's a lot of it's like one of those things that people sing to their kids, and there's little variations of different regions on how the lyrics go or how the melody go. So I kind of used them as sort of a starting point or like an inspiration, and sort of kind of deconstructed them into this large pieces that kind of are basically my impression
Mm.
on a lot of subjects and a lot of things that have to do with you know cross generational experience and cross cultural experience, and different levels of basically what kind of musical and what kind of emotional impact some of those might have
Mm.
on people or might have had on me, or and so it's kind of like a multitude of different significances, and it's based on the original lullabies, but sort of like the same way Villa-Lobos or Bartok or anybody who borrow from those kind of materials kind of evolved into being something different, and something
Mm.
kind of my own.
Mm. Yeah, I've
I don't know if I answered your question.
yeah.
Yeah.
When I started to listen to the videos that you were doing for the um, crowdfunding for the to record the lullabies, it was very interesting because I got I got the sense that the doesn't really matter in the end when someone is listening to the final music for the big band whether we trace it back to the lullaby or not. And
It,
it sort of reminded me of what we consider as depicted by music, which is probably the most how do you call it? Contested question. Does music remind you of a certain feeling, or does music just have its own language? And so that's why I'm interested in having this conversation, because I was like,
right.
wow,
Yeah,
this is
no, that
fantastic. Because he's asking, I
that
feel like you're asking those questions in a really inclusive way. Yeah.
right. I mean, yeah, I think you're right on point. To me, it's I think I've always been drawn to this. I don't want to say impressionistic idea, because I don't want people to think I am like you know deriving my elements from like Debussy or anything, or Ravel or anything like that. Although, those are big influences in the way I think music. But what I'm trying to say is, when I'm looking at something large like this, and most music I write to this day, it's about sort of a impression, or almost like, how can I say, it's imagery, is descriptive imagery in a way, but in a sound way. And at the same time, I am, not connecting it to any lyrics. And that's mostly on purpose, because I think that the less I basically induce people to find the meaning to it, the more they will actually find whatever meaning that is, it's truly theirs and not just mine. So of course there is my meaning in how I'm writing this, but at the same time I want it to be abstract enough that it's impacting people in a personal way. And I think the interesting thing about the lullabies is that if you don't know them, it doesn't really matter. If you do know them, it also doesn't matter, but it's interesting because it also impacts you relating to your experience.
Yes.
Like if you're a Brazilian who grew up listening to this, you might have an experience that is quite unique, because you relate this new impression that you're being exposed to with your own childhood and your own impression, or whatever, however that touched you in your life. It was very exciting to me when we premiered this, that I actually had my mother in the audience.
Oh wow,
and
that's wonderful.
It was really interesting, because it was just like, she's not a musician, and she grew up around a lot of musicians, and she sang all those pieces to me, and to her it was just like this overwhelming experience of listening to things that she can connect to in a very basic level, but it was just like this transformation, and it was very cool.
That's nice that she
to
was
have her
there.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she was visiting from Brazil, and that performance was actually in Boston, so it was not that easy for something like that to happen, but I was lucky enough that she was going to be here when we did it.
I remember one of the things that one of the best advices I had on writing music is that when you actually sit down to write the music, that's the last thing that you're doing, because you're writing music all the time. You're walking around and you're figuring out how to find the best problem, and how to, catalog almost a number of solutions. And then when you write, sit with the piano or the guitar or whatever it might be, that's the easy part. But
Right.
as a person who has a responsibility as a parent, and I know that you have as well, I want to talk about that balance of finding those minutes where you actually do sit down to write with the, you got the score. It doesn't matter if you figured everything out while you were washing the dishes and bathing the kids, or waiting for them to go to sleep. I just think it's fantastic, the challenge, and maybe also the gift of not having ever enough time to write the music. So I don't know how this happened for you specifically for actually writing the music for this specific project.
Well,
So let's talk about that.
it happens all the time. Yeah, it happens all the time. And I always joke with my students, and I teach composition and regularly in college. And so I have a lot of composition students, master students mostly. And I always joke with them, and I tell them that the best inspiration is a deadline.
Yeah.
Because it really gets you going. You have to you have to act on it. You have to make decisions. Of course, a lot of people get paralyzed by that, but I am fortunate enough so far to have been the kind of person who gets excited and my mind gets racing and I get things going, and I like to be the one not to actually, ever land a composition past the deadline that was
Yeah.
given to me. So, recently I worked on this concerto and it got premiered in April, I think, March or April.
Oh, wow.
But I had to be done with it. The conductor wanted a score by December. So I
Sure.
started working on it last August, and I spent about, July and August preparing
Huh.
the material, which was the hardest part because this was a really large piece. It ended up being, it was supposed to be between 20 and 30 minutes, ended up being 37 minutes long.
Wow.
And once I started writing, I wrote the actual piece in 2-3 months because everything was already prepared. But I don't always work that way. Sometimes
Yeah.
I like to have 2 or 3 really strong elements selected, and then I'll go from there and sort of see where that kind of sort of inspires me to go next. But I'm always looking at the form in the way where those elements are going to get connected or re-exposed, or maybe even sort of morph into each other or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those are some of the things that I like to do. And going back to your question, I keep my laptop always kind of open with my notation software on, and a lot of the times I'm doing things in between, taking care of dinner or whatever. And then obviously a lot of the times you end up writing music late after your kids go to bed, which is not necessarily, it's great, but
That's not
then
great
I
for the
can't.
relationship.
Well, it's harder than that. It's just that sometimes I can't get my mind to shut off. And
Yeah.
then I'll have an insomnia after writing like for 2 or 3 or 4 hours.
Wow.
And then that music just keeps on playing in the loop.
Hmm.
So that can be a little difficult sometimes, but it's good to have. I like to have plans and things. I have a couple of pieces that I need to start working on soon. Um, once I get the recording of the big band done, that's probably what I'm gonna work on. You know.
So
So
I definitely hope that we can get a link to hear the double concerto if there is a
yeah, I can
recording of it somewhere out there. Um, and now let's talk about the recording that's coming out.
Yeah, I'm hoping to raise a bit more money before the time comes, and but the recording is called the Lullaby Project, which is it's this suite of 5 movements I wrote for big band, inspired by each movement is inspired by a Brazilian lullaby, you know. Um, but the pieces are sort of their own thing, they kind of um, reconstructing or deconstructing, if you may say, those original pieces, and they sort of have a lot of kind of like my impressions, or I don't really know how to explain, but a lot of people associate some of the way I write with it's a simplistic way of saying, but let's say movie music, music that has sort of like imagery. Um, I, I've been writing for big band for many years, but I haven't really done a lot of, I haven't done a big band record. And one of the reasons being was because I never felt like I had found the language or the sound that I wanted
Hmm.
until now.
Hmm.
Um, I've always been more of a orchestral um, composer in a way. It's
Hmm.
always been sort of like my attraction from the beginning when I started writing for larger groups.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so I think it took me a few decades to find that sort of orchestral quality in the big band and be able to find a sound that is different from what you sort of expect a big band to sound like in a way.
Well,
Uh,
I can say from the snippets I've heard, I'm glad you took the time.
thank you. Yeah, and I'm not claiming to be somebody who's doing something that has never been done before in big band, but it's definitely the people who know me can definitely hear my style in that, and
Hmm.
it's definitely not your average like swing big band or it's just something that comes from a lot of different influences. It comes from some modern jazz influences. It comes from classical influences. It comes from Brazilian and Latin American influences. And when you put all those things together, you kind of have a very unique aesthetic.
Hmm.
Like I come from all those backgrounds. I studied classical composition and jazz composition, and obviously coming from Brazil and playing a lot of different styles of Latin music over the many years. But it's just something different that sort of brew over a few decades of you know composing, and I think until now it had not found its voice in the big band setting. So
That
but
that's.
now it's kind of like a mission. It's the new mission.
So, is this your big band, or is this like a collaborative group of composers? Or tell me more about the big band itself and well, the
Well,
the
it's
challenges of
my big
getting, what is it, 16 or 18 people?
18th. Yeah,
18.
I don't. If we're gonna go for a logistical nightmare, let's just go for the full nightmare, right? I always joke. I said, I almost named the big band the logistical nightmare because it's so difficult to put things together. And it's my big band, and I'm very grateful that there's people interested in doing it, and a lot of great talented people who I've met over the course of the last 22 years since I've been in the U.S.
Mm.
and who are very busy and at the same time trying to stay committed to a project like this, which is very amazing. Those, but it's I named that band the Interconnections Ensemble
Mm.
because first I don't want to pin like the impression on like calling it big band because it's not really the sound of a big band that you expect. I
Sure.
also didn't want to call it orchestra because it's also not an orchestral sound, but is a large ensemble.
Yes.
And the idea of working with so many layers of ideas that are interconnected
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
is what the name to me felt more. But it took me a long time to find a name that I actually liked. Um, but one of the things is you have to be cool and you have to be patient and you have to understand that people have busy schedules and you have to compile a really large list of subs and it's tough,
Yeah. Yeah.
but there's a lot of great people around that can do a great job, and there's a core of people who are incredibly committed, and I'm grateful that they are willing to come and play. I don't even actually, even though I'm a saxophone player and I play clarinet and flute and all the saxophones, I barely play on my own big band because there's so much work that needs to be done up front as a conductor,
Yeah. Yeah.
that I'm just not. It's just too much to handle. I really feel more comfortable being just the conductor. You know, it makes it. There's a lot of metric modulations. There's a lot of cues. There's a lot of things that would be much harder to do without a conductor.
So yeah, I mean, I was watching uh, my favorite version of Pierre Lunaire, and I was like, it's being conducted. It needs a conductor, and that's only 9 musicians, I think. And so,
Right,
sorry for switching tracks, but and that music is filled with layers and the stops and the starts and the so many changes in the in where the imagery of the poems are going. And I've always thought if someone's going to do something with a big band that doesn't rely on the tempo or the meter staying steady throughout the whole piece, then it needs to be done with this sense that every person really knows the music inside out, but it also needs a conductor who knows how to allow for the right amount of freedom and the right amount of strictness to create that platform. And
right.
I can't wait to hear the final product of the Lullaby Project, because I think maybe you're going for that sense that we don't have to rely on um, the existing strictness of what jazz should sound like, or to run us into sounding like a big band, but it's more related to uh, exploring as well as having a really strict fabric. So how do you see that? As
Well, I mean, there's been I think there's been since I would say the 60s a pretty large movement towards that kind of more modern approach to big band. You know, I mean,
mm,
uh, one of my favorite writers, arrangers, is Gil Evans. So
mm,
obviously he started this new concept of thinking of big band in a more orchestral way, you know, like the way he arranged for Miles Davis, and then later on how he continued to arrange to his orchestra, and then obviously people who came around that time after him,
mm.
like Bob Brookmeyer, you
Yes.
know, who basically taught a lot of the new generation of people, such as Maria Schneider and Darcy James Argue, and a lot of people who came after that, who basically
John Hollenbeck.
have, yeah, and they have, even John plays in his big band, but he has a conductor for
Right.
the big band.
Yeah.
So I think that what people are trying to do is so much more connected to, you know, in a way, compositionally speaking, to a classical approach
Yeah.
that is very difficult, you know, to do it without a conductor, you know, to do it well without a conductor. And you know, even if you look at classical music, when you get an ensemble that is a chamber ensemble, you don't need a conductor, because the certain amount of instruments you have, they can take care of communicating. But after a certain amount of people,
Yep.
it's very difficult to really have communication. Then, and some people need to really step up and basically lead, you know.
Mm, mm.
So most of the people I just mentioned, like Maria Schneider and Darcy and people like that, Bob Brookmeyer, you know, who's not with us obviously anymore, they have become conductors because of that, you know,
Yes. Yes.
because there's the conductor is another musician, obviously,
Yeah.
but in this case is much more than that. Somebody who really deeply know the music they wrote and who can actually create the sense of connection between everybody involved, you know. And
Mm.
obviously, I think there's the biggest difference, you know, the jazz approach always had in relation to the classical. And a lot of people talk about the improvisation, obviously, that's a big difference. But there's also this idea that you normally write for the people in the band, like, you know, like Ellington wrote for specific people he knew.
Yes, yes,
And Maria does the same thing.
yes,
And so does Darcy. And I do the same thing. I know the people I'm writing for, so I write to bring out their personalities.
yes,
And when
yes,
you're thinking, you know, when you're thinking about large orchestral classical music, unless you have a concerto that was written especially for someone,
exactly.
it's not the same, you know. It's not the, you know, it might have been that way, but then when the piece keeps on being played over time, you don't have those people playing them over time, and so it becomes something else. And normally that interpretation is in the hands of the conductor, obviously, you know.
Yes, yes. It's a
So
in the classical world, it's a powerful position, and the idea of improvisation. I mean, it in early classical music, like Mozart, I think improvisation was more important than it is now in relation to how Mozart's music, keyboard music, for example, is viewed. Uh, but right now we sort of have this idea that we should separate, you know, folk music from classical music and then from jazz, and that's one of the other reasons I like this project that you're doing is that it brings it invites a sense of getting rid of those divisions because they're kind of arbitrary and they're usually designed to be in the liner notes for an album or a, you know,
right.
the
Yeah,
programs for a
file
concert. You know,
the
it's
famous file under, right? That you put in the back of the
yes.
CD. File under, yes, file under. And yeah, I think what happens nowadays, and I can say based on what I observe, you know, in the musical business in general, is there
Mm.
is people who are really holding on to those separations, and then there's a lot of people who are collaborating and sort of like creating this others, I call like the subversive, you know, environment where, you know, I as a jazz musician can be writing a classical concerto, you know, at the same
Yeah.
time. So, you know, I'm not I am writing music for, you know, I'm being approached by important classical musicians who want me to write for them because I'm bringing something different from what other people might be bringing. So I think there's two different environments happening at the same time. There's always the people who are holding on to what's always been the norm, and then there's always people who are trying to break those norms, and, you know, in a nicely subversive way, you know.
Yeah.
And I think it has to be done in both directions, you know. Like I feel like I'm very subversive when it comes to jazz.
Right.
I don't play a lot of what you expect jazz to sound like or be like, you know. And I'm not going to write a piece that would be considered, you know, classical in many ways, you know. So I guess I fall into the cracks somehow.
Well, as long as we have at least 18 musicians who are willing to come into a room together and a list of subs, um, maybe,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I know what you mean about not fitting into a specific style, but it's so wonderful to have that community, that sense that you can you know, you can hear what you're writing, you know, you can sort of
Yeah.
there's nothing like that
No.
feeling of seeing it come alive. It's like, wow,
Yeah, no, I mean, you can never take that for granted. It's an amazing feeling. It's a, um, I don't know, almost indescribable in a way. It's like, you know, people talk about, religious experience, like like you're listening back to something that came from inside your head, but it's just playing back at you. And it's almost like you're observing your the inside of your head being played back at you. It's a very bizarre feeling, and it's an amazing feeling when things are going well. It can also be sometimes a very frustrating and stressful feeling when you're trying to put things together. And my music takes a little time to be put together, and until
Yes.
things click and people understand, how they click, it can be I've learned over the years to be very zen about that,
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
about having to find subs and having to wait until things click and finding and not freaking out when you have a bad rehearsal, because those things are part of the process, and it's really important that you
Yes.
you look at the bigger picture at all
Yes.
times.
Yes, because I was just reading in it's a book about practicing music and developing a music practice, and it was talking about the he called it the myth of being in the zone, that we write and read so much that relates to, sportsmanship and being in this right zone, that
Hmm.
even though it's nice when it happens, we'll paralyze ourselves if that's all we're looking for. You know, we'll never do anything, or um, strive for something if we always expect every solo to sound, to feel incredible, like we're like, in this incredible place when we're playing every solo. Well, sometimes we might be suffering from a really bad itch on our nose, but we still got to keep playing. But then
Right.
when we don't also know how it's being received. Um,
Yeah, that's a big difference too. I sometimes step out of stage saying, "Wow, this was not good," and then somebody might have recorded,
hmm, hmm,
on an iPhone or whatever, and or I might have recorded, and then I listen back and I go, wow, it's actually a lot better than I thought it was. It's just there's so much subjectivity in the way we're constantly sort of you know judging this, like in this kind of feedback loop of you know judging. I think the whole zone thing to me, and I've thought a lot about that over the years. Obviously, like many musicians struggle with trying to find a way not to be one of those, self-deprecating jazz musicians or something. Um, is the fact that it's not about finding the zone or looking for the zone, but it's the fact that you just don't let all this other noise sort of invade your moment, and you just basically try to not judge yourself or not let any of the environment sort of pressure you, which is hard. Sometimes you walk on stage and you see, thousands of people and you freak out, or you don't freak out, and sometimes there's two people in the audience, but they are people you really respect, and you just go, oh man, uh, those people are here and they're gonna know every note I'm playing and they're gonna judge, and so it's difficult to keep from that little voice or that noise that basically gets in the way of you focusing on the music only, but yeah, I think the best thing to do is just not to think about anything as much as possible.
Hmm.
That's what I try to do, not to have thoughts other than just music going on at that time. It's
Yes.
not always easy though.
Yes, I suppose what you're talking about might relate to this idea that you don't necessarily have to respond in any specific way to what you might be experiencing, and you just keep
Hmm.
going with the original idea, which was to play the music.
Right, right, yeah, and it's a difficult thing because sometimes you're going like everything's going well, and you have that moment where you go, "Wow, everything is just going so well, and I made no mistakes so far." Oops, and just the fact that you just became completely aware of that, or it's just it's the moment where things just you lose the focus or something. But I think the older I got, the less I cared about what other people thought, and
Hmm.
that helped.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah. This
that
is
really helped.
it's just what children do. They don't really care about what other people think. They just they just keep on
Yeah.
going with what they want to explore or do. Or yeah, that's it's a bit of a nice paradox there. So, when is the recording? When is the deadline? And how can people who are listening to this podcast help you reach it in a collaborative way?
Cool. Well, hopefully we can put a link. That I've been working with this incredible nonprofit foundation called uh, Fractured Atlas,
Hmm.
and so they you know they provide a platform for people to do fundraising, which is a little bit different from some of the other platforms because it's tax deductible, and which is better for everybody involved.
Yes.
Like the people who are actually contributing. So if people go on the link that we're going to provide, we have officially until September 12th. The fundraiser is going to be going until September 12th. We have a few performances in one in Western Mass and one in Boston in October.
Hmm.
And then at the end of October, we're going into the studio. And
Right.
I'm hoping to emerge in November with a record that I can start mixing and editing and everything.
And you're distributing it yourself.
Well, I work with a label out of Colorado, and
Right.
you know, once the record is ready, I normally send to them, and then we talk about dates to release and all the other things that go with. So
Great.
they've been very supportive to my projects, the several projects that I've done with them.
That's wonderful.
Been Yeah, it's which is rare nowadays. It's rare to have that kind of support. A lot of people have to do it all by themselves. You know.
It's a nice thing to have a third party who is looking after some of the business side of it rather than having to do every single bit yourself. That's great that you have that.
Yeah,
Well,
true.
thank you so
I also
much.
Thank you. I also work with a publisher, so most likely when the record goes out, all the music will be published at the same time, which is
Oh,
very exciting.
that's
We'll have
fantastic.
people can buy scores and parts and you know have fun with it if they like.
Um, that's good because there's a few universities in Australia that have quite very active big bands. So I'll hopefully be able to introduce you to some of the conductors and the educators there. Um, Thank you so much for talking to me about your process and this some really fantastic and very practical advice in there. And is there anything else you like to talk about before we finish?
Um, Let me think. I think it's this day and age the music business is a very difficult thing, but I think people need to believe that they are in for the long run. I think what really makes a difference is to really not give up on your vision and not give up on your project and really stay there, because a lot of people who you see they are doing well and getting recognition, and they endured a lot and they've been
Mm.
through a lot, and eventually, I call it the natural selection. It's is the survival of the fittest, is the people who really want and really believe in themselves, which is really hard when there's not a lot of people believing in your stuff yet. It's very hard to stay focused and believe in yourself. But at the end, those who stay there and really fight for it are the ones who are gonna come out the other way, with something. So that would be my only advice to people. I've been doing this in the U.S. for 22 years.
Mm. Mm. That is spot on. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think what I'd like to add to that is that I think along the way, that kind of commitment and that kind of I like to think of it as singularity of spirit with an absolutely open mind, um, which we can't fix our mind on uh, in a way that would be detrimental to the actual thing that we're focusing on, but being really open but committed at the same time is inspires everyone that we might come in contact with, and we don't know that it's inspired them. And I think that's the beauty of it, that along the 22 years you've inspired many people who you don't know their names, but it's a fantastic way of looking at how society can um, well listen better, I suppose. So thanks so much
Right.
for sharing your experience with
Thank
us.
you. I think you're right on point when you say you need to be flexible, because life changes and you change, and sometimes your original goal also needs to change, and you have to have that flexibility
Mm.
of reading the signs that are being given to you along the way, along the process too.
Mm. Great. Well, we'll definitely talk again maybe after the CD has been released, but thanks again for joining us, Philippe.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me in the show.
Great.